Okay, we are live. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Annex, a sociology podcast. My name is Joe Cohen. I'm a sociologist at Queens College in the City University of New York in New York City. And today we are kicking off the spring 2023 semester with a great topic: how Americans misunderstand China. We have some terrific guests, and I think it's an important topic, not just for sociologists and anthropologists, but like society at large. And it's an area where sociology and anthropology, because we're talking to an anthropologist today, has a lot to contribute. China looms large in the American imagination, and we think a lot about China because China matters. It matters in economic affairs, in international politics, and increasingly in science and culture. But when we contemplate the country and its government and its people, are we thinking in caricatures? Like, what do we really know about China? What it's like, how the system works? Our relations are with the country and the society are important. So if we're going to engage, we might as well do it with realistic understandings. And who better to turn to clarify, the inner workings of society than some experts on the topic? And we have two terrific experts today. First, I want to introduce you to Emily Chua. Emily is an anthropologist at the National University of Singapore. She's author of The Currency of Truth: Newsmaking and Late Socialist Imaginaries of China's Digital Era, with the University of Michigan Press. It's a book about how the media functions in China, delving into the details of the practical lives of Chinese journalists. It looks terrific, and I'm really excited that she's able to come on the show. Welcome, Emily Chua.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. Thanks, Joe, for organizing and having me.
And
Really
I'm
looking forward to the conversation.
and I'm particularly excited because you stayed up quite late. What time is it out there in Singapore?
It's a little past 1 in the morning.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very grateful for that. I couldn't do anything past 9 p.m. So hat tip to you. Now, our second guest is Yawen Lei from Harvard University. Yawen is the author of The Contentious Public Sphere: Law, Media, and Authoritarian Rule in China with Princeton University Press. It's a book that talks about how the Chinese government managed public opinion through censorship and regulation, and also how people came to use those institutions and create a public discourse or a civic discourse. We'll get her to talk a little bit more about it, but first, welcome Yawen to the Annex. It's great to have you.
Hi, Joe. Hi, Emily, and thank you for having me.
First of all, I guess first of all, happy beginning of the semester to both of you. Have you guys started yet? Have you started teaching yet?
I just started.
Like this week, you just started?
Yesterday.
Yeah, my first day is tomorrow. How about you, Emily? Have you started
We're in
yet?
week 3.
Oh, you're in the thick of it. Well, one thing that I has been on my mind, and I've been dying to talk to somebody about it, so I just want to get 2 minutes of your time. I want to talk about Chat GPT because honestly, it is completely shaking up my world, and I don't even know how to teach this coming course. And I saw this story in the news today. I just want to put it up here, just because I think it's really something else. This is news that came out yesterday. Chat GPT passed an MBA exam given at Wharton. The professor, it was like an entry-level exam, I guess, to see if you could like waive the organizational behavior requirement or something along those lines. And he said the student got a B, and the professor would have waived him out of the course requirement, which means, basically Chat GPT can perform like a first-year Wharton MBA student. I don't know. What are you guys thinking about this technology? Like, for me, it's just, I don't even know what to think about or what to make of it. What have your reactions been?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, and if you don't mind, I just jumped in because this afternoon I just started my GPT account, and I asked it to do a Marxian analysis of a situation in which someone had worked for them or they had worked for someone else. And it was really shocking sort of seeing the words just sort of stream onto the page of a solid B answer. But that said, it was a really a B. and
Yeah.
nothing. It was very truthy and sort of a very weak argument, just sort of plausible sounding things. I don't know,
Truthy.
Yawen, have you,
Yeah, I as a person who study sociology of work, I'm always very skeptical about this kind of news because we have heard about how robots, how softwares would replace a human worker for hundreds of years. And I think that happens, but to some extent, and then there will be new kind of jobs that occur. And I see that we have a tendency to have some kind of technological fetishism. So I personally study robotization, automation in China in the Chinese context, and I saw that people's hope deviates from the reality. We really give technology too much power. That's my suspicion, but I don't really know. I haven't begun to use ChatGPT, and I hope ChatGPT can do more.
But so you think it's not going to, you think everybody's a little bit too overexcited about it. We're ultimately going to be disappointed.
Right. Yeah, like AI, right? Machine learning. People have been talking about this for many years. Automation.
Right. I gotta say though, in some ways, it has been amazing to use this technology. I think that there is a certain type of student, like a true B student, not the great inflated B student, but the true B student. Like in my mind, a B student is a student who you give them instructions and they'll give you exactly what you told them to give you, and it will be really polished and nice, but it'll have no imagination, no real meat, but it'll be really well executed and they'll do exactly as they told. And I think those students are in trouble. They're like the students who were really good at doing an ANOVA by hand in 1960, right before like computers came in. That's my feeling. Emily, do you have a different take? Are you like, what are your feelings?
No, same. I mean, there's sort of been, I've gotten fed a lot of articles about how this is really a challenge for teachers because how are we going to identify plagiarism? But I think, I mean, it's really a challenge for students because how are they going to distinguish themselves from an AI in terms of their value add for a potential employee? So, I mean, I almost feel like one could really quickly turn it on to the students where the assignment is to, prove that you can do something better than this AI bot, because that's what you're going to need to do when you get out there. Because the AI bot is $42 a month. I think they just introduced their sort of premium package, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, if you're trying to make more than $42 a month, you're going to have to do better than GPT on this assignment.
What are your plans? Either of you, like, do you has GPT altered your plans at all for the upcoming semester? Or are you starting to at least think about things different, or like are you just waiting and seeing, like, what's your posture towards GPT right now? Either you want to, Yawen, you want to,
I haven't changed my plan, so I assign homework and writing to students, but usually I tend to trust students, and I told them I truly trust them, and I believe that they will do things with integrity.
How about you, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't reacted fast enough to sort of revamp everything, but I was testing my assignments against this sort of possibility. And I think, they're sort of, I'm teaching a third year class right now, and it's sort of designed to test sort of so-called higher order skills. So I think it would take a lot of work to train GPT to give you a pretty good answer to these questions. So I don't think it's that much of a thing for this semester.
I have a feeling like when the image generation came out, I had a feeling like eventually we're going to see so much of it that our eyes are going to start to recognize generated content. Like our eyes will instantly recognize generated text, and it will come to be seen as bland or milk toast or otherwise not valuable. I think eventually we're going to catch on, but there's going to be some people who are going to have to find a new thing because some stuff is just not valuable when you're competing against the computer. You have to find some new jobs. Anyhow, let's move on and get started talking about China. That was interesting. So this is a great topic, and I'm really excited to be talking to both of you about this. I will profess that, my understanding of China up until I came to Queens College was akin to like how Americans saw the Soviet Union in 1985. You know what I mean? It was like dated and obviously caricatured. And it's not like it's one of those caricatures that you have, but you just never even rethink it. And it was only when I came to Queens College, which has a very large Chinese population. I have lots of Chinese colleagues, where I really came to understand, like, I was very simplified and almost caricatured, embarrassingly so. So I'm really grateful to have you both come on to the show today to talk about it. And I thought that we would just start off like just with a global take. You both have had a lot of interactions with Americans, and I'm sure Americans have come to you for your expertise on China. From what you see, like, how do Americans misunderstand China just globally? I mean, there's probably a million ways, but are there some really obvious, sort of recognizable ways that Americans fundamentally misunderstand the country, the government, the people, its institutions? Emily, do you want to start us off? Like, what are your impressions? How do Americans, in a general level, misunderstand China?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think I think maybe the sort of strongest impression I have is that sort of despite a lot of scholarship sort of trying to dislodge this image, there is still this tendency to imagine China as a place where a very small handful of almost all-powerful sort of party leaders directs the lives and the minds of the rest of everyone, being this huge and powerless and undistinguished mass. And I think sort of my experience of working there and studying there, learning about people there, is that things make a lot more sense for me when I think of society as a much more sort of intricate network of very fluidly shifting relationships. In journalism, for sure. So that's the sort of topic of my research. I think when you think of this image, when you hold on to this image of sort of small cabal with a huge powerless mass, there's a tendency to think only in terms of coercion, or to be very focused on the question of control and coercion. And the sort of cost of that is that you don't get to think about anything else that's going on. In news being one of the most culturally and socially significant institutions in the world's most populous country, there's lots of things going on besides party control. And so that becomes a sort of cost of that, I think.
Yawen?
Yeah, I have similar observation. Actually, I have three things that I want to say. Perhaps I just say one of them first. So it's related to Emily's observation. So what I say is based on my reading of tweets and also my talking to many people. So first, I think people tend to really, as Emily said, that have a monolithic view of the Chinese government. So now I focus on the Chinese government. So they focus only on the top of the government. So this view holds that top level leaders have tremendous influence on the entire political system. And also it assumes that some kind of coherence exist within the state. So there is no doubt that the Chinese top leaders are very powerful, and we shouldn't really neglect this fact. This is really a fact. However, the Chinese bureaucracy is enormous and complex. In fact, I would argue it's one of the most complex organizations in the world. And one of the most influential concepts in Chinese politics is called fragmented authoritarianism. So based on this view, the authority below the very peak of the Chinese political system is actually fragmented and disjoined. And this fragmentation is structurally based. And scholars have pointed out that this kind of complex system, and also sometimes the conflicting inter-government relationship, shape the negotiation between different government agencies, and can influence policy implementation. So in fact, it's not uncommon for the central government, for example, to encounter problems and resistance when they ask the local government to implement its policy, because each agency, each government unit could have its own interest. But of course, the level of fragmentation can vary over time and across different parts of the government. And the re-centralization of power under President Xi Jinping have reduced the level of fragmentation since 2013. And in fact, one of the way he tried to reorganize the bureaucracies is really to re-centralize, because he saw such fragmentation as a weakness of the Chinese state. Yeah, so Emily and I share a similar view.
Wait, I want to clarify, because this is really profound in some ways, right? It's like, so the bureaucracy itself is like its own almost society in a society, and it's something with which the leaders themselves have to contend, and it's sort of like almost an independent force, is what you're saying. And how big? It must have millions of people in it. I mean,
Yeah,
if
a
it's
lot
the
of
Chinese public
bureaucrats.
sector.
Yeah.
It's also quite profound in the sense that, you know, I mean, this is something obviously sociologists should recognize,
Right.
that governments have limited capacity to do what they want to do. It's like, I mean, and of course it would be true in China as well. Like, a government is just an organization. It can only do so much. What about that? So that's very profound. So power is more distributed, and it doesn't just reside in the leaders. It's also interesting because then you realize when you assume that the leaders control everything, you're really writing off a whole country as, like, you know, just drones or mindless, and that's probably far from the case. What else? You said you had three. Can we get the two others? That was good.
Yeah. Okay. So also, I think people have a tendency to associate social protests with political instability or the regime instability, because I think sometimes Americans tend to be too excited about protests in China and try to overinterpret the consequences.
Right.
And and in fact, protests are not uncommon in China. Protests happen almost on a daily basis. But most protests don't really threaten political or regimes stability. And many common protests target businesses or local governments. And for example, workers organize protests to get their wages from employers. And peasants organize protests to ask local government to give them more compensation when the government take their land. But most protests are very localized and are organized by a small group of people, so they don't really threaten the regime. So as Emily said, that we shouldn't really, there are just different kind of social group, different network, different bubbles, and then people have different social group have very different interests. And scholars who study Chinese politics agree that protests threaten a regime stability only if they lead to divisions among top political elites. And I'm sure you both know the recent white paper protests in China, right? So that protests were very kind of unusual because they took place across many cities and were joined by different social groups, including the urban middle class, the working class, and also college students. So that were actually quite unusual. But even this kind of protest didn't really threaten political stability, because the political elites were not divided by the protesters, the protests.
If we imagined authoritarian societies to have broken civil societies where protest isn't allowed, speaking ill of the government isn't allowed, what you're saying is that the Chinese system actually has incorporated some type of consideration of these mechanisms. Like, protest is regular and there's a feedback mechanism. So it's not just purely a one direction. The government tells you what to do and then the people do it. Is that what you're saying?
People resist from time to time, and the government has developed a lot of tactics in terms of how to dealing with protesters, and that has been very important agenda for the Chinese government. I think the problem is really the level of civil disobedience. So this time, I mean, during the white paper protests, I did find something quite unusual, because in some parts of China, there were not, at some point, so there were not enough police to control the situation. And, you know, when people follow the rule, then you don't really need to have so many police. But then this time I did see that they were struggling a little bit, but after the government took action, they still can control the situation.
Amazing. All right. And then before we turn to the books, I'm enjoying this. Please give us number three. Number three.
Okay. So let me talk about number three. So, okay, let me think about how to articulate. So I think this misconception is about China's political economic system. And in the US, many people think today's China is a communist or socialist country. And it's very misleading. And I think when we talk about communism, we are talking about a social order based on egalitarianism and the common ownership of property. And when we talk about socialism, we mean a range of economic and social systems characterized by social ownership of the means of production. And is it true that China is ruled by the Communist Party? But in reality, China today doesn't really have a communist or socialist system. And instead, it's an authoritarian state capitalism. And China is one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of income and wealth distribution. So China and the US are very similar in this aspect. And also in China, in its institution, in terms of allocating access to public goods, often discriminated against the working class and the disadvantaged group. And also the Chinese government is the single most important actor involved in capital accumulation in China and probably in the world. The development of China's economy in post-reform era is a result of the Chinese government's alliance with different kinds of capital, foreign capital, domestic capital. And for example, Wall Street's financial capitalists often lobby for the Chinese government in the US. So in the US, I saw both the right and the left have misconceptions about the nature of China's political system. So when Republican criticizes China as a communist party, I was wondering, what does that mean? What that means? You're talking about this is a communist country, but actually China is not a communist country. Yeah. And also, I think left, especially radical left in the US, tend to romanticize the Chinese Communist Party. But in reality, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't do anything or doesn't do a lot to increase the inequality in the country. So I think this is really, I think it's strange, and people tend to see the label Communist Party, but actually they are not Communist Party if we define communism seriously.
Yeah. I have a question for both of you. Is it that in some ways our conceptions are stuck in like 1960s Cold War thinking? Is that what's going on with us? A lot of us are sort of just trapped with old ideas that we haven't broken out of.
I mean, that tends to be sort of, it does often seem like a Cold War framework is the easiest way for people to sort of just contain China conceptually and not deal with its contemporaneity. I mean, I think China is, it's such a puzzling presence when you recognize it's in the 21st century, and everything that's happening in 21st century is also happening in China. So as Yawen is pointing out, you can't just think of it as this communist state where everyone's living these dreary lives and obeying Big Brother. I mean, it's got massive booming economy, cultural change, social change, all of that upheaval that comes with sort of rapid consumerism. And I think, so that's another sort of thing that's interesting for, I think, sociologists and anthropologists think about. The sort of existential struggles of people on a day-to-day basis are not all about party control. It's so much about, what social and cultural change, like what kind of person should I be? What kind of values should I be pursuing? Moral frameworks sort of having to be revised. All of these are issues that, are happening there as much as they are happening here. And there's so much possibility of discourse, but that can only happen if we sort of move past that Cold War framework.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That you make a really interesting point that are these old mistaken conceptions preventing American people and Chinese people from interacting, separate from politics, separate from international relations? I bet it is. I bet it does have an effect. It's a very profound observation. So why don't we shift gears? Because, there is obviously a lot to learn about China, and it's certainly a complex country. And the only way to deal with complexity is to take a look at some narrow slices of it. So why don't we start by talking about the currency of truth? And let me just get it up on the screen here just for a second, in case anybody wants to buy it from a better bookseller. The Currency of Truth by Emily Chua is a book about the news media in China. Well, why don't we start off? Emily, tell us about the book. What's it about? How did you get started in it? Just give us sort of a plain language sort of telling.
Right, cool. Okay, so yeah, the backstory, I guess, of the book is that I wanted to write an ethnography of newsmaking in China that didn't set out from the question of what does news do for the party or what does news do for the people, but instead sort of asked what news articles do for newsmakers themselves. How do newsmakers understand their articles to work? How do newsmakers understand the meaning of their articles? Yeah, I wanted to sort of set out from the question of journalists' everyday lives and see what they think their news articles do for them. And I wanted in particular to work with ordinary journalists rather than journalists who specialize in what gets called investigative or critical news reporting, because I think a lot of the English language work about news and journalism in China has focused on this very brave and very admirable, but also very exceptional group. I think Yawen in her book on the contentious public sphere actually mentioned that investigative news articles account for less than 1% of the total sort of news content that gets published. So I guess I kind of wanted to write about the 99% of ordinary journalists. And these are journalists who aren't necessarily out to become party-defying heroes, but who do actually have moral and professional ideals that they're trying to pursue alongside more practical things that we're all trying to pursue, like career and salary and so on. So I think there's been this sort of tendency, what I was trying to push back against is this sort of tendency to categorize journalists in China as either being the sort of very brave and boundary pushing kind, or being this very sort of mercenary and self-interested kind who will write whatever the party pays them to write. And I think that sort of stems from this tendency to see China in terms of control, because if control is the only story, then there's only two options, right? You sort of either defy control and get punished or obey and get rewarded. And I wanted to write about, I think that's sort of quite a destructive caricature of the 99% of ordinary journalists who don't fall into either of those categories. Who, like ordinary people everywhere, are on the one hand trying to live socioeconomically sort of rewarding and secure lives, but also trying to do the right thing and make themselves good and worthy individuals. So I wanted to write,
So wait, I have a question. So I'm understanding you talked to sort of like the beat reporters. You were talking to like the person who does the sports beat or the metro beat or all of those sections that don't involve geopolitical conflict between the Americans and the Chinese. Is that basically?
Well, no, actually, I mean, the journalists that I spend the most time with actually were writing for a section called the politics section. But they weren't, I mean, when 99% of the politics articles are pretty run-of-the-mill sort of reports on just what's happening with this and that party office or, new policies, new achievements, pretty ordinary stuff.
But I have a question, because it's also interesting. Like you're talking about a prevailing view that like looks at the practice of journalism through simply the question, like, are you on the Chinese side or are you against the Chinese side? Right. And that's like what they've reduced the entire profession to, is what I'm understanding. And it rings very true. Is that, am I sort of getting it, or?
Yeah, that's sort of the reductive binary that I'm trying to push against, because, most of the time you're writing in China, there isn't a question of whose side are you on.
Yeah, Emily, I also have a question for you. Sorry for jumping in.
No, please.
So, like, what is the period in which you did your ethnography, the specific period?
Yeah, so I spent about a year working at the newspaper. It was year 2010 into 2011. And then
Mm-hmm.
after that, it was mostly follow-up visits and interviews
Mm-hmm.
up till about 2018 now.
Yeah, thank you.
So wait,
Yeah.
go. Yeah.
Oh, so I'm asking because the larger political climate has changed so much
Yeah.
in 20 since 2012 and 2013. I'm just very interested in knowing. I mean, you have your follow-up observation, and how
Yeah.
did you observe change over time? Is there any change in
Mhm.
terms of their daily practices when we consider the change in larger political climate?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely the scope. There was a feeling, it was very palpable that this for sort of more critical statements shrank. And also that there were more and more assignments that were more and more structured in terms of what is the political message that is supposed to be carried across. But I guess what I think is important to highlight is that, there's a tendency to say, okay, as soon as Xi Jinping came on stage, then media had to become very obedient and propagandistic because of this very powerful person on top. But really, anything that happens has to happen through these complex networks, right? It's sort of not just the person at the top can order this to be the case, and now everything's going to be the case. So, I mean, I guess what I observed was how the new sort of propaganda objectives really had to work their way through to the local propaganda officers and their demands, which then had to work on the editor-in-chief and the sort of executive level of the newspaper itself, which then had to sort of trickle down to the particular department editors, and everyone along the way has to somehow become incentivized and become aligned. So it's a much more sort of tooth pulling process than sometimes it gets written about it. So it's very easy to achieve.
How does that work? How does the government sway the news then? What are the concrete mechanisms that they use to influence journalism or influence what's reported?
Yeah, so I mean, Yawen has written a lot about this. I don't know if you want to. Yeah, well, so certainly, I mean, the most obvious sort of direct mechanism is just the directives that get sent from central and local propaganda office to the newspaper, to its editors, editor-in-chiefs, who then have to send that down. But I think something that I write about in the book is how actually a lot of the incentive to stay aligned actually comes from the commercial interests of the newspaper rather than through direct political.
Let's introduce Yawen's book and make it a little more dynamic, because really she is the best person to answer this question. So Yawen, let's just bring it in. I just want to give a reminder about your book, just in case anybody forgot. Yawen's book is The Contentious Public Sphere, Law, Media, and Authoritarian Rule in China. And Yawen studies the precise mechanisms by which the government influenced news, but that it had some unintended consequences. Let's start with just the mechanisms of control, Yawen. Exactly how does the government manage the news in such a big and complex system?
So, as Emily pointed out, they have these propaganda officials who are in charge of censorship, and they would look at your topics to see if these specific topics are doable. So, I am trained as a political sociologist, and I specialize in the past in political sociology and also social movement collective action. So my book was more, I think I interviewed many journalists, but most of them were doing this kind of more critical reporting. And so the government would restrict the topic they can work on. And also after they produce something, so there are layers of layers. So they have editors, chief editors, and party officials who could read their writing and just kill the publications before it came out. It went out, and also there was a golden period when Chinese journalists were faced with less control. But then after Xi Jinping became the president, then there has been more intensified control. And I remember in 2013, since 2013, the government began to actually put official propaganda official as the chief editor and also editors of news organizations. So in the past, those people were the chief editor were actually professional journalists. And then I know because China has some kind of more liberal leaning, very influential news organization. So those organizations were purged by the Chinese government. So they use propaganda officials as chief editors, and that really that really had a lot of consequences. And so the period I studied was a very optimistic period. And after Xi became the president, many of the journalists I knew in the past either left their job or actually exile, and they actually moved to other countries because of the potential problems.
Oh. So it sounds like self-selection is like a big mechanism, both in terms of, if I'm understanding this right, if you're a young journalist and you want to be editor-in-chief of, I don't know, the Beijing Times or whatever it is, the big paper, it helps to be a party functionary as well. And it helps to discipline the organization from within. Is that what you're saying? And so in a way, you have journalists who are aligned with the party, and then they'll leave if they don't want part of it. That's what I'm understanding. Am I mistaking this? Or?
I think it's more nuanced. So there is really no white or black or white. Are you affiliated with the party? Because the party is such a complicated structure.
Right, of course.
And in fact, many people within the party are very open-minded, and they really want to have some kind of reform. And so a lot of news organizations are affiliated with the party, but there are also a lot of heterogeneity among them. So I think that they left because they just didn't see that in the past. I think most of the people whom I know saw some space or fragmentation that I mentioned earlier. So they saw some space where they can, for example, utilize the conflicts or different interests between different parts of the government structure, or some government really want to make money, so they want to utilize this opportunity. They saw there was a space for them to do something that they really want. But when this space shrink, some people saw there was no hope, but they just left. And also so there was also a trend. I think since perhaps early 2000, and China's IT industry began to prosper. And then there are a lot of big internet companies in China began to actually collect and combine news. So they provide news service. And many media professionals, journalists who worked in news organizations began to work for the internet companies because they saw there is a chance that they can reach out to a much broader audience through working in internet companies. Because in my book, I mentioned that, so in China, there was no a national newspaper, kind of more commercialized national newspaper like New York Times, this type.
Okay.
But then internet companies actually serve this function at one point of time. And people saw hope in working for the internet companies. And many people actually left liberal-leaning news organizations and to work for this internet company. But again, after the crackdown, many people feel hopeless. And many of the journalists or media professionals whom I know before began to work as public relation person, public relation company to deal with relationship between governments and corporations. So many of them actually shifted to other career paths. So that's actually why I was asking Emily question about the period she studied, and also because as Joe talked about, there is a selection process. Some people left, some people stay, and then just there are different career paths. And recently, I was very surprised because so Harvard has a master program called that's specialized in East Asian countries. And I have students from China, many students. And I was so surprised to know that some of my Chinese students still want to become journalists. They want to go back to China to work as journalists, even though they recognize it's so difficult to produce and the kind of news they want to produce. But they do see hope, and I admire their courage a lot.
Yeah. That's very interesting, just to jump in terms of the contrast to the sort of ordinary journalists that I've been working with. They actually haven't really left. Not so many of them have left the profession. And in fact, one of the things they would always say is that, the more idealistic you are, the more likely you are to quit. And so that was sort of part of their distinguishing themselves from the sort of harder ball pushing, sort of boundary pushing journalists. That's a sort of a vulnerability in the sense that if you are, the more idealistic you are, basically the more frustrated you become, and the more tempting it is, or the more you're inclined to just leave in sort of frustration and join a PR company, real estate. There's a lot of consulting, a lot of different professions that pay better. And that you don't have to deal with this constant frustration, this constant sort of sense that your profession is not able to function the way that it should. So I think, even in 2010, for these ordinary journalists, there's the recognition that it's a constant struggle, that, they were sort of prepared for this long-term uphill battle that will be marked by very limited success. But that is the sort of goal on their horizon, and that's sort of, I think it's in a way they're compromised with having to produce articles that don't live up to their own standards. That compromise is actually what enables a kind of sustained practice of the profession. So that was sort of a different approach that they had.
Right. And I think Emily's work is super important because it really shows the different classification, different kind of journalists in China. And as Emily really pointed out that maybe China scholars focus on the type of journalists that I study as a political sociologist. And so Emily's work really complement people like work, like sociology, like myself's work.
I have a question just for clarification in the contrast between your two vantage points. Is it that sort of like the Tom Friedman of China or the big editorial people, they'll get watched, they'll be subject to whatever government oversight, they'll be tangled up in politics. But when you drill down to the neighborhood shopper, little newspaper, and whoever's, the party's just not at that level. Is not really functioning very much at that level of journalism. Is that what's happening? Am I misunderstanding this? Or so it's only the big shots get watched, and then there's a layer of small-time journalism that just operates freely or more freely.
I'm not sure, Yavin, what you think, but I wouldn't sort of distinguish it I wouldn't say that, if you lay low enough, you sort of escape. I wouldn't say that that's true, but I would say that if you're small enough, or if you fail to become big enough, you might not get read at all. And that's actually something that a lot of the journalists I was working with, a lot of the time were writing, for the politics section, very sort of mainstream articles, and they didn't expect anyone to really read them. And so that actually is part of the argument that I developed of how news in today's China, maybe it's more fruitful to think of it less as a sort of mass communication medium and more as a kind of currency. I mean, I can explain that analogy if you want.
Would you? Because that was interesting. I did want an explanation.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess, if you think about money, right, like say a $10 or $1 bill, there is some content on its face, a 10 or a 1, and that's sort of legible at face value. But what that dollar bill actually does for the people who use it is really a function of the particular setting, the particular relationships within which they're using that dollar. And that kind of value isn't legible from its face, right? And so I guess what I argue is that newsmakers in China are often using news in a similar manner, sort of less to communicate something to a public and more to do things within the particular settings and relationships that they find themselves in. So for example, a journalist might write an article about a particular local company, not so much with the objective of telling the public about this company, but more to earn some esteem from one of her editors. Or the editor-in-chief might publish an article in praise of a party policy or a party office, not really to, tell the masses that the party is great, but mostly to forge an alliance with that local party official. And the reason for this sort of practice or this usage of news, I think in China's context, is not because Chinese journalists are particularly unprofessional, which they often get sort of cast as being, but really because the political as well as commercial and sort of digital technological circumstances have combined to create this situation where many journalists like those whom I worked with, can no longer assume that their articles are going to be read. So on the one hand, they're sort of in this conundrum where they want to write articles. The orienting goal and the horizon that they're oriented to is to write articles that have a big public impact. But in the meantime, they feel really strongly that they need to survive by writing articles that actually do more for their bosses or their business clients or their local political patrons, because these are the relationships that their survival depends on.
How's technology changing all of this? Internet, social media, and not just how's it changing journalism, but how's it changing public dialogue in China, the public sphere that Yao Wen talks about?
When I began to do my dissertation, because I actually wrote my book based on my dissertation, that was a period when China's social media, the internet, became more and more popular and advanced in China. And so that creates a lot of public opinion leader. I think that was one very important change. So many journalists, they are not only journalists anymore. So even though they were journalists, but they were able to reach out to a huge audience because people recognize them and appreciate their work. So they became very popular and very influential. So they are some of the public opinion leaders. And at the same time, so many lawyers who share similar political ambitions with some famous journalists also became public opinion leaders. So then public opinion began to emerge in China. And these people are super, super influential because their followers, the number of their followers actually became larger than the audience, the readers of many newspaper. And the government just freaked out because when something happened, when local governments had some trouble, made some mistakes, these public opinion leaders began to mobilize ordinary people to participate. And at one point of time, many protests happened, collective action happened, because public opinion leader began to utilize technology to reach out to huge audience. And then that's actually led to the Chinese government's crackdown on these social media companies. And these social media companies have to hire in-house censors to read through all the posts, social media content. So that's one very important change. And another important change is there are a lot of people who are not trained, who are citizens, who become citizen journalists, and through this kind of technology, they can also reach out to a huge number of readers. So these are significant social change. And actually, I also know a lot of censors who were hired by internet companies. They actually receive very low pay, so they are low skilled workers. Yeah. And they also can use software to actually censor. But in addition to this kind of automation, they also had to actually read using their eyes. And some complain that they didn't receive enough salary, and they overwork a lot, and some even quit their job because the job was no good.
Amazing. You know that they're very reminiscent of changes we're experiencing here. It's just sort of, I mean, there's censors in media companies here in America, and so many of the dynamics. But wait, Emily, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. I just got
Yeah,
excited.
no, that's exactly where I was going to go with it. Actually, was to think that, you know, the effect of one of the effects of technology, as well as sort of as Yaron was discussing, a sort of complement to that would be, you know, the sort of in America there is discourses about the rise of digital media leading in towards a crisis of journalism, or taking us into a sort of post-truth news era. And I think you know, that comes from the sort of fragmentation of audiences, and the same question or concern or struggle is also sort of, I sort of saw happening with the journalists that I was working with, where the effect of digital technologies is such a fragmentation of audience, and that puts so much pressure on the news companies, right? Or it makes it so clear that news companies are sort of struggling to capture attention if they can, and everyone's sort of livelihoods are hinged on this and at stake in this. And what it did was to make it very bring it very much to the surface that when content gets produced, when truth claims get circulated, it's always being circulated for some particular interest or objective. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen, right? And so there's sort of no pretense of an independent or an altruistic or a purely for the sake of truth kind of news practice. And then that becomes a very part that sort of contributes to this ongoing existential struggle of trying to be a journalist working towards the good. It's so clear that this medium is a medium of particular agendas. How can we then think of it as potentially a site where a public good could be achieved, right? So really sort of challenging the heart of news as in the possibility of a public as in the sense of a collective that meets in discourse, that can meet in and through common truth. I mean, all of that sort of comes under threat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I am really walking away from this conversation is that, you know, if we stop to think of China in less caricatured terms, you see that it's another modern society, and the things that are affecting us are also affecting them. It's not a completely different system. Like, we're all sort of going through the same things, and I'm really surprised by the parallels. So I have one more question. What can Americans learn by taking China more seriously? By really, by getting away from the Cold War caricatures and really having an earnest and deep engagement with the society. What do sociologists and anthropologists, in particular American ones, like, what can we gain by opening our eyes to the complexity of China, the nuance of China?
I think, I mean, in this era, right, China has become so powerful. It's just important for people to be an informed citizen, so you can participate. So people, American, can participate in meaningful conversations about like policy, perhaps in the U.S. And because U.S. really has been U.S. has so many policy related to China, and if all of the policy makings are based on inaccurate understanding of China, that would be a disaster. And I will give you an example, a very unfortunate example.
Yes, please.
So President Clinton made very important decisions about trade relation, U.S.-China trade relation, back to late 1990s. And at that time, he assumed, and also some lobby, like some politicians, some business people try to lobby the government. And the assumption was that marketization and political and democratization would go hand in hand. So that's a very strong assumption. And then now we know what's the outcome. And a lot of calculations, a lot of agreements, a lot of policy were based on that very, very wrong assumptions. And I do believe that a more realistic understanding of China would be very important for the US. And every year I teach an undergrads and also graduate level course on contemporary Chinese society. And so many students are very eager to learn, to have more accurate understanding of the complex system in China. And I think that's how I contribute to a more
Yeah.
a better understanding of China. And so many of my students, my students include like officials from the US. So they graduate from college and maybe they got job from the Department of the State, and also include some officials in in Japan or Singaporean government. So this, and also I have a lot of students who want to be computer scientists. They want to do business, and they really think it's very important to learn about China. And I think, unfortunately, development in the US, in American sociology, I would say, is American centric. The tendency of focusing only on American domestic issue. And I do think it's very important to understand and address problems in the US, but it's also important to know other parts of the world. So for me, as a sociologist who study China, I would really appreciate if there are more Americanists in our discipline can pay more attention to what happens in China. And I also hope like top journals wouldn't reject our submission just because our findings cannot be generalized to other contexts. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
Emily?
Yeah, this is such a big and hard question.
Yeah.
I feel like there's the possibility of recognizing these really important parallels. And I guess it does come back down to sort of America and China being contemporaries.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and including communism or socialism and liberalism having been sort of the twins of the 21st century, the 20th century, right? And sort of, I guess, what seems to be a common transition, call it crisis if one wants, but is that we have moved out of the broadcast era. And the broadcast news was one of the pillars of what Charles Taylor's called the modern social imaginary, right? This idea that nations and societies can constitute themselves as a people or a public through the medium of the printed or the broadcast word, that the text, right, would be the place where a sort of a polis can be created. And socialism and liberalism were two different versions of actually that same ideal, right? So whether it was the party that had the monopoly on the truth and sort of propagated that truth to everyone else, or on the other hand, whether every individual is able to contribute and say their own opinions and still arrive at some collective truth, both of those were ideas that through discourse, we would arrive at a common understanding of our reality and therefore be able to discuss a common way forward. And I think on both sides of this divide, we're at a situation where that no longer seems to be the case, right? There's, whether it's because of technology or commercialization or the fragmentation of audiences, there is really this question now of is it still possible for people to meet in the space of the text? Or is it the case now that all these publicly circulating truth claims are actually just, fueled by one particular outlook or interest or another? In which case, what is the possibility for collective life, right? If we've sort of lost the news as a space of common discourse, then where are we going to find another one?
Well, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, I mean, not that America can learn from China on that, but that, if we could recognize that we're both of these are in that same sort of crisis, we could all stand to learn something from that, probably.
That's what I'm walking away with. I'm really walking away with the idea, it's so obvious when you say it, but sometimes you don't recognize it. There's a whole society going on in China. More than that exists, more than whatever is going on between China and the US or geopolitical affairs. It's just like a rich empirical, it's a complete society with rich empirical material for us to better understand what we study. And it's like really to our detriment to shut ourselves off from like a sixth of humanity, basically, when we don't take it seriously. I just, one more thing, we got to go because we're up to an hour, and then my producers get mad if the show goes over an hour because they have to cut it. But before we go, if there's anybody listening who is interested in China and wants to follow more, you got any good books, any new books from colleagues or friends that you want to plug right before we go off? Any recommendations, any canonical books that we can't miss? Give us one reading tip if you can. Emily, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, so many ethnographies of China. I feel like ethnography is a great way in to this sort of to just sort of instantly access the richness and the reality and the complexity of this other space. So I don't know. I mean, I can think of a good friend of mine in your city, Columbia, is Nick Bartlett. He's written a book about recovering drug addicts in China and how the process of drug recovery, what that looks like in China, as particularly a post-Mao context. People, colleagues and friends writing about everything.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of nonsense for me to be like, can you name any good China scholars? Because that's like someone saying, can you name any good scholars? It's like, yeah, I can name a lot of scholars.
I feel like should I just
what a dumb
friends?
question.
I mean, it's kind of weird.
It's a dumb. Well, let me ask you this: is there any? First of all, that book sounds awesome. Like, I'm glad I asked the question because I'm totally going to look at this book.
Yeah, it's called Recovering Histories.
That sounds awesome. That sounds very awesome. But like, okay, but fine. But do you have any more friends whose books you'd like to plug before we go off?
Yeah, I actually want to recommend a great book. Can you?
Oh, hold on. Yeah, your green screen is. There we go.
Yeah.
The Logic
it's called The Logic of Governance in China. It's written by Professor Shiguang Zhou at Stanford Sociology. So I think this book gives the most accurate and insightful analysis of how the Chinese government at a local level operates on a daily basis based on his ethnography. So it's very difficult to have access to local governments to really be able to observe their daily operations. So for anyone who is interested in Chinese politics and how the Chinese government operates, this is a great book to read. I read the Chinese version because in the beginning he wrote a Chinese version, but now the English translation is out. So I really cannot wait to read the book in English.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank you both for this, for coming to this panel. I learned a lot and it was eye-opening. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Joe, for
thank you so much.
It was super fun. Thank you, Ellen. It was really
nice
to talk to you.
Bye.
All right. So first of all, today, just before we go, let's just one more look at those books just to be sure that everybody sees it. So if you enjoyed this conversation, you can catch Emily's new book, The Currency of Truth, Newsmaking in Late Socialist Imaginaries in China's Digital Era. That's with the University of Michigan Press. And Yawen's very, very well-regarded book, The Contentious Public Sphere, Law, Media, and Authoritarian Rule in China. Two terrific books, two really wonderful scholars, and I want to thank you both for coming on today. It was great.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
All right. You've been listening to the Annex, a sociology podcast. The Annex is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. For more information, visit queenspodcastlab.org. On behalf of